Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is a returning guest, Alexander Clarkson, lecturer on German and European Studies at King's College London. Hello and thanks for joining us, Alex.
Hi.
We are speaking on Monday, January 20, the day after the Libya summit in Berlin. The goal of the host country, the UN Security Council permanent members, and several Arab players was threefold: to enforce the UN arms embargo, solidify the recently agreed ceasefire, and lay the groundwork for a political resolution to Libya's civil war. In the end, after some 4 hours of talks, leaders committed to respect the UN arms embargo and stop arming the warring factions while also calling for progress toward a permanent ceasefire. Yet, I was thinking, 2 days before the Berlin summit, Turkish President Erdogan vowed that Turkey would start sending its own troops to fight in Libya. And as he was leaving Berlin, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, voiced concerns about how the embargo commitment could be monitored. So is this agreement toothless? Was anything achieved in Berlin?
It's the start of a process. That's the best that can be said about it. I mean, where the process goes and how far it might eventually leads to any kind of outcome in the short term in terms of stopping the fighting, we'll have to see. I'm very skeptical about that. But it's very interesting in that it has actually brought these different states together and is actually in the process of creating a structure through which an eventual resolution of the conflict could be achieved. I mean, if we look at, obviously there are big differences in many ways, but if we look at the Lebanon War of the 1980s, I mean, the process to resolve the Lebanon War in the 1980s had its roots really in the aftermath of the Israeli invasion in 1982. That's 8 years before the final accords were signed, before the process was brought to an end. And I think in the Libyan war, at best, what we can hope for is that these contacts that are building up and this renewed understanding now between all sides involved that this conflict is not necessarily sustainable does create a dynamic that if the conflict continues in the current pattern, which I think you can make an argument for saying that it probably will, that you eventually have a kind of process through which contacts can be built up between all sides. Some kind of back channel, structured back channel, can be created between the GNA factions, which are very disparate groups of factions under the UN-recognized government of national accord, and the LNA factions, which is broadly a kind of group led by General Haftar, who seeks sole power for himself. The kind of back channel process can be built up to make deals and make agreements between these different factions possible, if and when they begin to realize that possibly military victory is impossible for them. I mean, the problem is of course that at this moment in time, Haftar, the general still leading the LNA, still believes, and he might have some case to believe, that he might have a pathway towards victory, that it's not necessarily as straightforward as he and his backers might believe, which also puts the GNA side and its external factors like Turkey under a lot of pressure to ensure that the GNA survives and can keep fighting and prevents this takeover by Haftar. So I think there's a process in place. I think it's it might be something that can work out in future. It's good, perhaps it's probably good that it's there. And it's also an interesting sign of European re-engagement in the Libyan field after European strategy and the strategy of various European member states was completely disrupted in April 2019. It's a kind of, they're coming back and they're going to start, they want to play a bigger role. They want to engage more. They're sort of testing the field and seeing what they can do. And that might eventually also involve the Europeans in various ways inserting more troops, inserting gendarmes, inserting various kinds of putting skin in the game, as many people like to call it, to actually play a more active role. I think there's a consensus in the EU side that it has to play a bigger role, and that might have consequences for everyone else. Because the EU is a bit like a super tanker. It takes ages to turn, but once it turns, it kind of fixes on a route and keeps going. And we're seeing the EU turn. We just don't know quite which route it's going to take.
Yeah, many observers have said that Europe, as well as the U.S., which together led the 2011 intervention that ousted Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, had done next to nothing to end the chaos that ensued after his departure and encourage some sort of resolution, and that they only began taking action in recent weeks in response to the rising influence of Russia and Turkey. The thinking was that the Berlin summit offered Europe, and also maybe the U.S., a chance to make up for these failures. Would you agree that they had largely forgotten about or neglected Libya, and did it seems like Berlin did begin to change this perception?
I think there's a lot of amnesia around that. There's a lot of amnesia as to what happened between 2011 and 2014. And then what happened is the Italians became much more central to the developments in Libya as of 2014, 2015 afterwards. The Europeans in many ways, the European member states in many ways, have been very active in Libya. I think if you look at the British, that's a different story. I think the British have what we've seen with the British, but that's a general strategic issue with the British, is a gradual withdrawal from playing a more active role in any of these conflicts. And its role, for example, in the Iranian JCPOA issue is more of a legacy of previous governments than what the governments since 2010 or 2015 have been doing. But broadly speaking, I mean, all kinds of different European players have been heavily involved in Libya. The problem is that they've been partly working against each other. So the EU's problem hasn't been lack of involvement in Libya. The EU states and EU institutions have been doing a lot of things in Libya, but one, a lot of those things, one could argue, were not good things that these different states were doing. And second of all, particularly the Italians and French, right up until early in 2019, were working at cross purposes to one another, because the Italians had one set of partners, many of which are closely affiliated with the GNA, with which it had built a set of relationships to deal with migration, energy security. I mean, the Italians even have troops and a military hospital in Misrata. It still has a residual presence in Tripoli port, but that presence was much larger before in the spring of 2019. And the French have very heavily worked together and backed with Haftar, who is fighting various factions the Italians have had built relations with. Now, this is evened out over time as the Italians have tried to build a relationship with Haftar as well, while trying to balance their relationships with other actors in cities like Misrata that support the GNA. But that's also meant that the Italians are seen as less trustworthy suddenly by old partners and friends that they had on the GNA side for a long period of time. But, the various ways in which the Italians and the French have fed in arms and cash, have supported different structures that were involved in migrant smuggling and trying to turn poachers into gamekeepers, turning into the Coast Guard. People control the borders. The way they've wheeled around different parts of southern Libya and the Fezzan has arguably contributed to various escalations and dysfunctions rather than improved them. So in some ways, I think these accusations are wrong. The EU and the EU member states have been heavily involved in Libya throughout, but they might actually have contributed to the crisis rather than ameliorating it. So I think, in that sense, there's two problems in terms of viewing the EU. Everybody tends to view the EU as a kind of fuzzy bear that is kind of harmless and nice and wheels around a little bit aimlessly and doesn't do very much in these conflicts. Actually, if you unpick things a little bit, you can find EU institutions and EU member states at every level. Sometimes they're doing things that can ameliorate these crises or resolve conflicts. Sometimes the particular strategic dynamics of the EU as a whole, the needs to protect the EU's borders and the strategic aims of the EU member states actually contributes to these conflicts and makes them worse. But to claim that the EU wasn't present, I think, is a slightly problematic claim.
And just to the second part of that, do you see them now increasing their engagement and maybe the positivity of their role?
I think they've been stung. I think they've been stung by what the Turks and the Russians did. And I think, yes, this was a fiasco for EU's active engagement in Libya. I think the fiasco wasn't what happened in October and November in terms of at least the Russian involvement in terms of mercenaries started a bit earlier in July, August. And then you have the Turkish gambit of signing this memorandum of understanding with the GNA over the Eastern Mediterranean and then engaging with Syrian mercenaries and anti-aircraft equipment and so on to keep the GNA in play. I think that stung the EU because the EU had a feeling that what had gone wrong wasn't something that it had time to fix. So the EU had built up, the EU played an instrumental role, and particularly the Italians played an instrumental role in setting up the government of national accord in the first place. This is kind of forgotten again in the course of 2018. And the EU was kind of hoping that this would kind of create a kind of structure that could integrate various different factions, maybe also pull people away from various factions away from Haftar that had supported him and weaken his position a little bit. And the EU hadn't counted on several things. The UAE had invested so much, and Egypt had invested so much in Haftar that they weren't willing to see him outbid. So they increased their support for him to ensure he held these factions on and gave him the leverage and power to escalate. They didn't count on the extent to which various groups on the GNA side weren't willing to cut a deal and weren't willing to actually enter into dialogue with anybody associated with Haftar, and that opened up a whole set of problems. And the EU and the EU member states overestimated their leverage. The French, in the end, because they'd, again, sunk so many resources into Haftar, felt kind of obliged to protect him, which, again, gave him within EU structures a degree of freedom of maneuver. The Italians didn't have the amount of leverage they thought over Misrata and other factions in the GNA. So what we saw in April 2019, when the EU was trying to build up this policy of reconciliation, negotiation between the different factions, is a situation where Haftar if it's simply in terms of his own position, quite shrewdly realizing that if there was going to be a peace agreement, it was going to bypass him and weaken his position, realizing that his only choice was to escalate, to stay on top of his coalition of factions, he decided to open up a military move, which surprised a lot of people, by the way, including me. Like, we've all made mistakes on Libya in terms of calling things wrong occasionally. And in that context, Haftar completely disrupted the EU strategy and EU member state strategies and coordination. He forced the French to go back to backing him. He disrupted Italy's influence over its different groups and proxies and partners on the Italian ground, and that opened up the space for Turkey and Russia on both sides to take advantage of this polarization and try to sort of entrench their support and sort of gain more influence in the Libyan field. So this isn't like Europe returning. This is partly a product of a very active EU policy and a very active EU member state policy that just went badly wrong in April 2019. So what the Europeans are now trying to do is get back in and trying to, some cases, fix mistakes that they made, and in trying to exert a degree of influence over this process, which they think that if Russia and Turkey, say, are allowed just to leave and run their thing, or run their whole process, which will simply make the situation worse over time.
Bloomberg reported that in Berlin, nobody was able to reason with Haftar. On Twitter, you responded that this is, quote, maybe because Haftar has a more realistic appreciation of his own strategic dilemmas than various rivals or partners. I wonder, what did you mean by that? Were you referring to this, his willingness to go all in?
He has to go all in. I mean, this is every time Haftar has, Haftar's grip over his various coalition of factions are based on a set of commitments and promises backed by UAE cash largely, not Russian cash, but UAE cash largely, that they are going to get certain things if he takes power. Right, and that once he's in power, he's in the position then to distribute all of this patronage to all these different factions that are behind him. So that the problem Haftar faces is any deal he then strikes with GNA factions would involve power sharing and would dilute his ability to distribute patronage using oil money and oil resources, large amounts of which he already has under control, though not by far not all of it he has under control. But it would dilute his ability to distribute patronage to all of these people he's made promises to. I mean, there's an additional problem for him in that there are kind of very different factions supporting him. There are various tribal groupings that were once hostile to Gaddafi. There are various pro-Gaddafi groups that have now swung in behind him. There's Madkhalite, sort of Salafi groups that have certain interests. They're very secularist, military-oriented groups that support him. So he also has to face the difference of regional and ideological factions below him that he has to sort of play off against each other. And throughout, what keeps him on top is this promise that, eventually, if you back me, I have this support from UAE and other external partners. I know what I'm doing. I'm willing to go all the way. And once I go all the way and have control over that stuff, I will give you what you want. Now, the problem is if he shares power, he can't do that. Somebody else will also have control over patronage, presumably Swaley or Mishra, or somebody on particularly from Misrata, who are, again, have all of these rivalries and frustrations with people on Haftar's side. So in a sense, Haftar's only option, and I think he's worked this out. Again, I'm not saying that this is morally correct. I'm simply saying from his strategic perspective, correctly, he's worked out for himself that to stay on top, he has to keep escalating. Right? He has to keep going and going and going until, at the very least, symbolically, if not structurally, he can portray himself to all of these people that have backed him up till now that he is going to be the guy who hands out the cheddar, who hands out all the kind of different assets and patronage. He has to keep escalating. If he stops escalating, if he cuts a deal, then he's in a very, very difficult position because various factions that back them then can look at them and say, why should we keep backing this guy if we can cut him out and cut a deal with Misrata or whoever's in charge of the GNA or the Europeans? Hey, they're back, and work our way through all of this in a way that we can bypass Haftar and work out our own interests parallel to him. So, right. So he's like the cyclist. I keep using this metaphor, but it's a really useful metaphor. He's like the guy on a bicycle, and he has to keep pedaling and pedaling and pedaling because if he stops pedaling, he falls over and falls in the ditch.
Well, if this is the reality, then again, I wonder how they're going to enforce this embargo, because if Haftar keeps escalating, won't Turkey have to respond in kind?
Well, yes. I mean, quite. I think ultimately it comes down not just to Haftar, but also to people like you, particularly the UAE, that has sunk now so much time and so much resources and so much effort into keeping Haftar afloat. It's kind of like a sunk cost fallacy. I mean, again, the UAE is now so dependent on Haftar somehow succeeding because their whole strategy rides on him, that UAE he can pretty much blackmail Abu Dhabi and MBZ into saying, well, look, if I fail, your strategy fails. You have to keep supporting me and keep supporting my every escalation. It really limits the room for maneuver for particularly the UAE, but also Emiratis, but also the Egyptians, in terms of how far they can pressure Haftar. So yeah, I think until Haftar gets pushed back quite actively and I think he was at the cusp of this when he lost the city of Garian, which is a crucial strategic city that fell to the GNA in August. And it looked really bad for him at that point in time. But again, he was able to turn around to the Emiratis in particular and say, if this goes wrong now and I fall, you lose everything, because all the guys below me, they'll cut deals with everyone else and they'll find a way out and they'll stop listening to you. They'll start, talking to the Italians. I mean, they'll talk to the French, because the French are sort of maneuvering a little bit as well. But they'll maybe cut a deal with the Russians, because the Russians are talking to both sides too. I mean, the Italians and Russians are pretty analogous in that kind of relationship they have with both sides. And so, again, he was able to then draw in more support from the Emiratis. He was able to turn to the Russians and say, do you want to roll in all of this? Give me some mercenaries so you can succeed. That will give you some more leverage over the Europeans in this context. And he was able to sort of go all out and start again, and now eventually take the strategically crucial city of Sirte to Misrata's east. So until Haftar is pushed back, finally, in a way where it's very, very clear that he cannot keep going forward. And that's what where the Turks are now playing a role in terms of supporting the GNA. Until it's very clear that he cannot keep moving forward, he has no choice but to escalate. The problem for Haftar is, if he gets stuck, his survival chances potentially sink very fast. So he's a potentially very, very disruptive actor. So the diplomatic dilemma is how to get this guy to be willing to make a compromise or make a deal when any compromise or deal threatens his own position automatically. And I don't have an answer to that, right? But I think that this is the dilemma everybody faces over the next couple of weeks and months in terms of bringing this down. In particular, the EU. I mean, what can the EU offer him? I struggle to see what the EU can offer him, really. And it's additionally problematic that the person pushing back against Haftar, Turkey, Erdogan, the AKP, have done so in a way that has then gone on to provoke every other neighbor of Turkey and then undermine support for the GNA, because the way that Turkey intervened and the price the Turks asked of the GNA for this intervention, which is this memorandum of understanding, which also leads to escalations in the Eastern Mediterranean.
That's great lead-in for my next question. The Greek government considers the Turkey-Libya maritime borders memorandum a blatant violation of international law and an attack on Greece's sovereign rights. Before Turkey and Libya signed that deal, Greece had stayed neutral on Libya, but since the deal, Greece has emerged as maybe Haftar's most vocal supporter in the West. Writing for Ahval on Sunday, Greek analyst Yanis Koutsoumidis said Athens had notified its European partners that it intends to block any political resolution in Libya that fails to cancel the maritime deal. Cyprus has also gotten on side in recent days as its foreign minister visited Saudi Arabia over the weekend to confirm a shared concern about the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. So what's your view? Could Greece and Cyprus throw a wrench in a possible resolution in Libya?
But for the Greeks and the Cypriots, absolutely, as long as the memorandum of understanding is in play. I mean, the moment the memorandum of understanding is removed from the table somehow, then, I mean, all Haftar will get from the Greeks and the Cypriots are their best wishes. So, I mean, it's not like they're solid supporters of Haftar, although they obviously treat the GNA and they have suspicions of various groups involved in the GNA. And they're also, the extent to which the GNA it was previously once a show affiliated with the Italians. So there's all kinds of possibilities for maybe massaging this problem out of the way. But right now, until, say, Italy can give the GNA a better offer, we have this memorandum of understanding on the table. As long as it is on the table, the Greeks and Cypriots are in a position and will block any kind of EU move to come to some sort of form, a final resolution that doesn't force the GNA to break, or at least find some form of words to show that its commitment to the MOU is less than cast iron, and it in particular wouldn't back an attempt by the Turkish government to slow down other processes in the Eastern Mediterranean by throwing this into international law or international courts, or using it as a means to assert Turkish claims. So the GNA is actually caught in a bit of a trap. Short term, it needs Turkish help because nobody else was willing to make the GNA that offer. The EU was too slow. The EU thought it had time. The Italians also were distracted. And I mean, the Italians were a crucial actor in terms of EU relations with the GNA. The Italians spent most of the summer of 2019 dealing with other matters because the Italian government collapsed. And that was to the great frustration of a lot of very smart Italian security bureaucrats or diplomats or military officers who knew exactly what was happening, but they couldn't get anything done in terms of an offer to the GNA because the Italian government had basically stopped working until about September 2019. And that was the opportunity for the Turks to come and say, nobody else is going to help you, right? We can offer you all of this stuff to keep you in play, partly because we value you, partly because we think a lot of our contracts, potential construction contracts to be restarted in Libya depend on you, and partly because we would like you to sign this document that then we think strengthens our position in the Eastern Mediterranean. And, the GNA will argue, and people in the GNA will argue, partly, I think, justifiably, is they had no choice, right? They needed the Turks to come in to ensure their survival because the Emirati, particularly, it's not so much the Russian mercenaries, but the Emirati air support was beginning to severely erode their ability to hold on at key front lines. So the Turks come in and make this offer. So in the short term, the GNA had no choice. The problem is, in the long term, it means the GNA burns any support it had with a lot of different EU member states. And actually, even for the Italians, makes it very difficult for the Italians to re-engage with the GNA on a much more fundamental level, because the Italians share Cypriot and Greek strategic interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, they're all on the same team there. That's what makes EU collective efforts there a little bit more assertive, or at least a little bit clearer in terms of dealing with the Eastern Mediterranean issue. So the GNA has this short-term gain, but in the long term, it burns its ability to build relations with everyone else. Never mind the fact that even the Tunisians and the Algerians are quite sketchy about Turkish policy, both Turkish as well as GNA, as well as LNA policy in the area. I mean, the Tunisians would like to be supportive, but again, it's not like they're that distant from the Turks in many areas, but they just do not like the Turks showing up and being involved at this level on the ground right next to Tunisia's borders. It even makes Nahta feel uncomfortable with what's happening. So in that context, the GNA has given itself some short-term survival, a short-term breather, but it's caused itself an enormous diplomatic nightmare long-term if it wants to diversify its options and not become too dependent on Turkey. Of course, for Turkey, it's ideal, right? Because they now have the GNA in their grip, and it gives the GNA very little room for maneuver in terms of kind of getting out of certain Turkish demands. But on the other hand, the GNA has to get out of those Turkish demands if it wants to ensure its long-term survival, because all the other neighbors surrounding it are very sketchy or very skeptical or very frustrated with the memorandum of understanding.
Meanwhile, Turkey is maintaining its aggressive posture in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it dispatched a fourth drilling ship to the waters off Cyprus last Friday. The Yavuz ship is set to drill inside an area licensed to Eni of Italy and Total of France. Cyprus responded by denouncing Turkey as a pirate state that flouts international law, while Greece spoke of Turkey's expansionist aspirations. I'm wondering what you think is next in the Eastern Mediterranean. How do you expect the EU and European players like France and Italy to respond to this?
I think there's two levels. I think the EU still doesn't want this to escalate, and I think the Greeks and the Cypriots know this. I mean, I think the Greeks and Cypriots talk very loudly, but they also know, and actually in some ways I think the Cypriots are, oddly enough, I think the Cypriots in some ways are in a more ambiguous position about being tough on Turkey than necessarily the Greeks. I mean, the Cypriots are the ones where the actual disaster would happen if it happened. So, I mean, they want to push Turkey very, very hard, but they also want to somehow create these. I think they're still looking for an off-ramp. Up to a point. The problem is the off-ramp the Cypriots want for TRNC, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and Turkey isn't necessarily the off-ramp that Turkey or TRNC want. So it's a diplomatic issue of kind of bringing those together. And I think the EU still sees itself as somebody from the outside who can bring its member state Cyprus, and work with its member state Greece to somehow find a way of trying to. I mean, it shouldn't be impossible to find a possible compromise option that at least pushes this back into business in law courts rather than in sort of confrontations in the high seas. But a lot of this is dependent on what Ankara does, and it's not just an issue of behavior. Like there could be, even in the best case scenario, I would see like a CHP-led Turkish government sending drill ships around there just to make the point. And I could imagine the Turkish Navy doing a few annoying maneuvers just to make the point, and sort of loud, threats of law and accusations. But a different kind of government, maybe an earlier version of the AKP government, would have balanced this with diplomacy, would have balanced this with active engagement and a different tone from different actors in the government. I mean, this is all
Right.
this
It
kind of
seems like
stuff
what
happened
they've been
before.
doing is like mostly inflammatory.
Yeah, it's been mostly inflammatory. That's not to say that some of what they would be doing wouldn't be done by any other Turkish government,
Mhm.
but it's not been balanced by a kind of outreach in a way that makes it possible to look for some sort of way of getting this issue at least out of a process of escalation and then under a process of agreement. And as a result, it makes it easier and easier for Cyprus and Greece, to particularly the Italians and the French, to turn to Italy and France and say, look, you can't trust Ankara. Ankara does all of this stuff. They're also now damaging your own interests. How can you trust these people? I mean, in Germany, there's a lot. I mean, Germany is trying to also act in a more mediating role, but I mean, there's a lot of bad taste going back to what happened during the constitutional referendum of 2017. The Turkish government burned a lot of bridges at that point in terms of the way it handled its diaspora. I mean, the Turks. It's like the mission of the AKP government has been it's almost like anti-diplomacy, right? It's almost a form of it's like there's matter and antimatter, there's diplomacy and anti-diplomacy, and this is like almost designed to generate the opposite outcome of what they claim to intend in terms of finding a negotiated solution. Which, just to return this briefly to Libya, I mean, a constant complaint you get from the GNA and from the Turkish side is saying, look, Haftar and the UAE are these malign actors, and yeah, you can make a strong argument for that, but the difference between UAE and Turkey is UAE has not gone around provoking the Europeans everywhere else. UAE is a problem in Libya. I mean, UAE is a real problem in Libya and has to be tackled. But Emirati diplomacy outside of Libya has not gone around provoking the Europeans at every possible opportunity. Whereas the Turkish government, I'm not accusing the MFA. I think there are a lot of really wonderful, good, hardworking people in the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, even in the Turkish Ministry of Defense, and MIT even. But I mean, there are a lot of people who know and are professionals. But it seems like the AKP seems on this mission to take what isn't necessarily a terrible negotiating position and make it impossible for everyone around them, that also includes Egypt, Israel, and others, to somehow sit down with Turkey and come to some sort of accord and agreement over these kinds of difficult issues. I mean, it seems to be Erdogan's mission to burn every possible diplomatic off-ramp Turkey has towards some compromise solution, which would have to happen anyway for any of that gas or natural resources to be drawn out of the Eastern Mediterranean.
It's almost interesting. You call it anti-diplomatic. It almost seems like an extension of Erdogan's use of fear domestically.
Yeah. But that doesn't work. That doesn't work internationally, right? I mean, he can use fear in Turkey because he shapes the Turkish political space. He doesn't shape the EU political space. I mean, a lot of Turkish, commentators or SETA people or Pelikan, whatever, believe they do, but they don't. Athens is a member state of Greece is a member state of the EU. Turkey is not a member state of the EU, and that matters because Greece, it can't necessarily launch initiatives to get the EU tougher on Turkey. That you have to build an EU consensus over time around that. But certainly the Greeks can sit there and block everything Turkey needs from the EU in a whole different other set of fields, and simply slow down process and make sure that things get more and more uncomfortable. And we're getting to the point where it's beyond Greece and Cyprus. I think the Italians are still very keen on maintaining some kind of good cordial relations with Turkey. But at some point, if you listen to the tone of people in Rome, security officials, that one of potentially Turkey's best friends in the EU is also getting fed up and saying this is enough. Never mind France or Germany or other states with which Turkey has already, the Turkish government has already caused all kinds of difficulties for itself. So, I mean, I can see this as a short-term gains. I mean, Turkey seems to, what he gets is a short-term gain with the MOU of the East Mediterranean. It looks great. It looks like Turkey's being forceful. But I just struggle to see how this doesn't land Turkey in a hole the next time it needs help from the Europeans.
Okay. Alexander Clarkson, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thanks very much.